I was sitting behind the wheel of my car in the parking lot of a gas station on the outskirts of Harlow, Tennessee, staring at an image on my phone. It was a photograph of a page torn from the Sunday crossword section of a local newspaper. 4 words, circled in red marker. The handwriting was unsteady, the kind that comes from arthritic fingers and 79 years of life bearing down on a hand that hadn't been treated kindly lately. But the message itself was anything but unsteady. I had been waiting 3 years for that signal. For a full decade, my parents had introduced me to every relative, neighbor, and church acquaintance as their unemployed daughter. The one who moved away and never amounted to anything. They said it at holiday dinners. They said it at cousins' graduation parties. They said it so many times that eventually the whole town just nodded along, the way people do when a story gets told often enough that nobody bothers to question whether it's true. What they never once suspected was that their unemployed daughter investigated people exactly like them for a living. And my grandmother had just sent me the code. What happened at that dining room table 45 minutes later ended up in the Harlow County Gazette. But before I get to that part, I need to tell you something about how a family decides one of their own is disposable and what it costs them when they turn out to be wrong. Welcome to Still Waters Stories. My name is Caroline, and I'm 36 years old. This is the story of how my family spent 10 years trying to erase me, and how 4 circled words on a crossword puzzle brought the whole thing crashing down. Most mornings, I'm at my desk before 7 o'clock. The office occupies the 2nd floor of a county government building in Easton, Tennessee. Fluorescent lights, industrial carpeting, a coffee maker with a permanent orange check filter light nobody ever addresses. Nothing about it looks like somewhere important. Nothing about it screams that the people working there have recovered millions of dollars from the people who were supposed to love their victims most. My nameplate says Senior Investigator, Adult Protective Services. I've carried that title for 7 years. Before that, I spent 4 as a field caseworker. 11 years total investigating financial exploitation, neglect, and abuse of elderly adults across East Tennessee. On any given week, I'm managing between 10 and 15 open cases. In that time, my unit has recovered more than $3.5 million stolen from elderly victims, savings accounts drained by grandchildren, pension funds rerouted by sons-in-law, property deeds forged by family members who gambled on grandma being too confused to notice. I've had my name on 52 closed cases. 52 families who got their money back, their dignity restored, or at the very minimum, the truth. I'm careful at what I do. I can spot a fraudulent power of attorney in the first paragraph. I can read a bank statement the way a pilot reads an instrument panel. I know exactly what's supposed to be there, and I know when something's been removed and why. The bitter irony was that my own family had absolutely no idea. They didn't know my title, my track record, or that I had worked cases that made it into court transcripts. They knew one thing. Caroline left Harlow after high school, moved to Easton, and never came back to do anything that counted. That was enough for them. 52 families received justice because of the work my team did. My own grandmother was not among them. Not yet. The crossword tradition started when I was 7 years old. Every Sunday morning, Grandma Ruth and I would settle onto the screened porch of her farmhouse, the same one her own father built in 1948, and work through the puzzle from the Harlow Weekly. She would let me hold the pen. I'd fill in the short words, colors, animals, 3-letter answers I was proud of. She handled the rest. But she always explained why, always made each answer a small lesson. Perseverance, she'd say. That's what 5 across means. It means you keep walking even when the road gets ugly. Grandma Ruth had taught 3rd grade at Harlow Elementary for 38 years. She retired with a teacher's pension, a savings account she'd built 1 paycheck at a time, and a farmhouse sitting on 35 acres that had belonged to our family for 3 generations. She was organized the way clockmakers are organized, not just neat, but precise. Her bills were paid by the 5th of every month. Her tax receipts were filed by year in a wooden box she kept in the kitchen pantry, going back to 1976. When I was 16 and the word college was treated in my household the way people treat a foreign language they've decided not to learn, Grandma Ruth found me on the back porch one evening after Thanksgiving dinner. She pressed $400 in cash into my hand and whispered, "Don't mention this to your mother. She won't understand." But I do. I sent my application to the state university the following week. 4 years later, I had a social work degree. 2 years after that, a master's. Every graduation, Grandma mailed me the crossword page from that week's Harlow Weekly with one word circled. Proud. That tradition, the pencil, the porch, the patience, was never just a habit. It was a private language, a code. And it would eventually save her life. My mother, Diane Voss, got pregnant with my brother Marcus at 18. She was 6 weeks into her sophomore year at the local community college when the test came back positive. She dropped out before the month was over. That was 1987. She spent the next 4 decades raising children, running a household, volunteering at the parish thrift store, and watching from a distance as women around her finished what she never got to start. I don't think she ever stopped grieving that. And I know with absolute certainty that she never forgave me for having the opportunities she lost. She didn't hate me because she was a hateful person by nature. She hated me because every time she looked at me, she saw the thing that had been taken from her, the chance to leave, to build something, to be somebody outside the limits of that town. And when I left and didn't come back with a husband or a recognizable career or anything she could describe proudly at a dinner table, her resentment hardened into something permanent. My father, Gary Voss, had driven delivery trucks for the better part of 2 decades. Honest, physical work. Then a back injury ended that, along with the income. The company folded during his recovery. He filed for bankruptcy. Somewhere in the aftermath, he discovered online gambling platforms, and somewhere in those platforms, he burned through whatever he had managed to save. Gary wasn't cruel by temperament. He was cruel by desperation. There is a difference, but it tends to feel the same to the people around it. He went along with Diane's story about me, the failed daughter living pointlessly in Easton, because it was far easier than explaining where his retirement money had gone. If everyone was busy discussing Caroline's failures, no one was looking too closely at Gary's. And then there was Marcus. 38 years old, still in Harlow, still working at the same auto parts store on Route 7 he'd started at after high school. Marcus had stayed. He stayed when I left, stayed when Dad went under, stayed when Mom needed someone to lean on. In his mind, staying was the definition of loyalty. Leaving was betrayal. He wasn't entirely wrong to feel that way. He was just wrong about what loyalty actually requires. 2 years before any of this came to a head, I drove the 40 minutes from Easton to Harlow for a church potluck Grandma had begged me to attend. She'd called during a narrow window when Diane was out at the grocery store, and her voice had that particular urgency I've learned to recognize in my work, the quiet kind, the kind that's been rehearsed so it doesn't alarm anyone listening. I brought a casserole, Grandma's recipe, the one with the shredded cheese crust, and I walked into that fellowship hall like I was carrying an olive branch. About 25 people. Folding tables. Paper plates. The smell of baked chicken and sweet tea. Diane spotted me before I spotted her. She was standing near the dessert table with 2 women from her prayer group, and she made no effort to lower her voice. "Well, look who finally showed up." A pause for effect. "Caroline's been sitting up in Easton. What is it you even do up there, hon?" "Nothing we'd recognize, I'm sure." The women gave the laugh that happens when people don't know how else to respond. Marcus was leaning against the far wall with a paper plate of roast pork. Without looking up, he said, "At least she showed up for the food. First useful thing she's done in a while." Bigger laugh that time. I set my casserole down, found Grandma Ruth at the far end of one of the tables, and sat beside her. She didn't say anything. She just reached under the table and squeezed my hand. Her grip was steadier than anyone in that room understood. I drove home that evening and pulled off on the side of the road about 10 miles outside Easton. Sat there in the dark with the engine running, watching headlights come and go. Then I drove the rest of the way home and went to bed. 18 months before the Thanksgiving that changed everything, the phone calls began to change. Grandma and I had a rhythm. Every Wednesday evening, after her favorite news quiz program, she'd call from the kitchen phone. She liked to stand at the counter while she wiped down the stovetop and talk, sometimes 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. We discuss her garden, my cases in broad terms since I couldn't share specifics, the crossword clue that had stumped her that week. Then the calls started getting shorter. 20 minutes. 15. 10. Diane's home. I can't talk long. That phrase appeared in every conversation like a lock clicking shut. I started paying attention. Grandma could only call during the time Diane was out grocery shopping. Wednesday mornings, roughly 40 to 50 minutes. Outside that window, nothing. One Wednesday she said something that made the muscles in my shoulders go tight. They've been adjusting my medication, dear. I'm honestly not certain what I'm taking anymore. In my field, that is a serious red flag. When a caregiver alters an elderly person's medication schedule without explanation, it typically indicates either negligence with the regimen or active use of it as a form of control. I asked if I could come visit that weekend. She hesitated. I'd love that, sweetheart, but call ahead first. I called Saturday morning. Diane answered. She's resting. Doesn't want company. I called again Sunday. Same response. I asked Marcus to look in on her. His reply came back flat and rehearsed. She's fine, Caroline. Mom takes care of her every single day. Just let it go. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table in Easton for a long time. I'd heard those exact phrases before, not from family, but from subjects in case files. I just never expected to hear them applied to my own grandmother. The following Monday, I was back at my desk working a case in Marshall County. An 81-year-old man whose daughter had been diverting his Social Security deposits into a personal account for nearly 2 years. Standard framework: isolation, financial dependency, manufactured helplessness. I built the evidence chain in 5 days. Charges were filed by Thursday. The man sat across from me in the conference room when it was over. His eyes were wet. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, he said. You made them believe you, I told him. By calling. I drove home that night and checked my phone. Nothing from Grandma. Nothing from Marcus or Diane. I ate a bowl of soup and thought about that man. He had someone who noticed. A neighbor who called the hotline. He had our office. My grandmother had none of those things, because the people who should have been watching were the ones rearranging her finances. I hadn't said it out loud yet, but the professional part of my brain had been quietly assembling the picture for months. Shortened calls, medication confusion, access denied, isolation from outside contact. Every warning marker in the APS field guide. I'd spent 7 years learning that the moment a subject knows you're watching, the evidence disappears. I had never once imagined I would need to apply that lesson to my own parents. Then Grandma's property tax record appeared on the county delinquency list for the first time in 47 years. Property records are public. No badge required, no subpoena, just a name and a county. I typed Ruth Voss, Camden County into the state database on a Tuesday during my lunch break. The result loaded in seconds. Delinquent. 5 months overdue. $3,900 owed on the farmhouse and 35 acres that our family had owned since 1948. Grandma Ruth paid that bill every January like it was sacred. She kept the paid receipts in a kitchen pantry box organized by year, going back 4 decades. 47 consecutive years of on-time payments. Now this. I called her neighbor, Dorothy Parrish. Dorothy was 73, had lived on the adjacent property for 25 years, and was exactly the kind of woman who notices things without being asked. She and Grandma shared garden cuttings, went to the farmer's market together, and waved to each other across the fence every morning. Something is very wrong over there, Caroline. Dorothy's voice was low, careful. Your mother doesn't let Ruth off the property anymore. I haven't seen her in the garden since April. She used to walk over to my fence every single morning. Now I don't see her at all. I asked about my father. He comes by 3 or 4 times a week. Brand new pickup truck, expensive boots. But the gutters on Ruth's house are pulling off the fascia. I've watched them droop for months. New truck, new boots, delinquent property taxes, collapsing gutters. I opened a personal notebook, not a case file, just a concerned granddaughter documenting what she found, and started writing. Dates, observations, direct quotes. Dorothy became our bridge. Every Wednesday morning, when Diane drove to the grocery store 20 miles away, a round trip of nearly an hour, Dorothy would slip through the gap in the hedge between their properties and knock on Grandma's back door. She'd bring a thermos of herbal tea and a folded copy of that week's crossword, and she'd hand Grandma her cell phone. The first real conversation I had with Grandma in months lasted 9 minutes. Her voice was thinner than I remembered. She spoke quickly, stacking sentences, outrunning some invisible clock. Gary handles all the money now. I haven't seen my own bank statement in months. Diane says I was making errors with the bills, but Caroline, I have never once made an error with a bill in my entire life. I asked about her property tax. She didn't know it was overdue. I asked about her rheumatoid arthritis medication, a weekly injection she'd relied on for 7 years. They changed it, she said. Diane told her the doctor suggested something cheaper. But no one had taken her to the doctor. I asked about her pension checks. Gary picks them up from the mailbox. He says he deposits them directly. I haven't held a deposit slip in 4 months. I wanted to tell her everything, that I recognized every single pattern she was describing, that I had seen this exact architecture of control in case file after case file. But she wasn't ready to hear it framed that way. This was still her daughter. I can't make accusations against my own child, Caroline. I had heard almost that exact sentence in the majority of my cases. You don't have to accuse anyone, Grandma. You just have to let someone help. I drove down to Harlow the following Saturday and knocked on the farmhouse door. Diane opened it a few inches. I'd like to visit with Grandma for a while, I said. Sit with her on the porch. She's tired. She's not up for company. Behind Diane, a television game show played at full volume, the kind of loud, bright program Grandma had always despised. She watched documentaries about nature and history. She watched the evening news. She did not watch afternoon game shows at max volume. I'll wait on the porch until she's feeling better, I said. Diane's jaw tightened. Suit yourself. The door closed. I sat in the wicker porch chair where Grandma and I had done crosswords for 30 years. The garden was dead, not the sleeping dead of winter but the neglected dead of abandonment. Tomato frames rusted and collapsed. The herb bed smothered in crabgrass. Grandma's garden had placed at the county agricultural fair 3 years in a row. Now it looked like no one had touched it since spring. An hour and a half later, Gary pulled up in a pickup truck that still had the dealer sticker on the back windshield. He climbed out in work boots that hadn't seen a day of work and stared at me. Go home, Caroline. You weren't invited. I looked at his truck. I looked at the gutters pulling away from the roofline above my head. I looked at the dead garden. Nice truck, Dad. He went inside without responding. I drove back to Easton. In my notebook I wrote, date, time, access refused, observations, new vehicle, property maintenance abandoned, television volume consistent with sensory control of occupant. That was the last time I knocked politely. Dorothy, it turned out, had more than a thermos and a crossword to offer. 10 years earlier, When Grandma was sharp as glass and thinking several moves ahead, she had opened a secondary savings account at a credit union across town. A reserve, she called it, for emergencies. She'd put Dorothy on the account as a co-signer. The logic was simple. If anything ever happened to her main accounts, there'd be a separate pool that only the two of them could access. The account had held just under $10,000, untouched for years. Dorothy visited the credit union on a Monday and asked for a 6-month statement. What came back made her grip the counter for support. 3 withdrawals. $250 each. All at the same ATM on the main road through town, the same one Diane passed on her grocery runs every Wednesday. Diane had figured out the PIN. Dorothy drove directly to the coffee shop in Easton, where I'd asked her to meet me if anything developed. She slid the printout across the table without a word. I looked at the transaction dates. Spacing of exactly 2 weeks. Location consistent every time. Wednesday mornings. I'd built prosecutable cases on less than this. If she found this account, I said, the main account is worse. Dorothy's eyes were wet. Ruth saved that money over 30 years, Caroline. Birthday checks, Christmas bonuses, the occasional surplus. She used to call it her independence fund. She paused. I don't think she was joking. I folded the statement and placed it carefully in my bag. First evidence. Not the last. The next morning I was sitting across the desk from my supervisor, Walter Thorne. 24 years in the department. The kind of man who'd seen children steal from parents and parents steal from grandparents and every configuration in between, and none of it surprised him anymore. I need to file a third-party report, I told him. The alleged victim is my grandmother. He didn't blink. Conflict of interest. Acknowledged. I can't lead the investigation. I'm asking that Sandra Merritt take the case. I'll provide the initial intelligence and step back. Sandra was the strongest investigator in our unit. Methodical, patient, thorough. She'd handle it correctly. Walter studied me for a moment. How long have you known? Suspected? Over a year. Known enough to act? A few weeks. He nodded slowly. Are you holding up? I looked at the stack of reports on his desk. More than 200 in my career. Everyone had felt like pulling something difficult but external out of someone else's life. Clean. Professional distance. I've filed 200 of these, Walter. This is the first one that made me feel physically ill to write. He pushed the form across the desk. Third-party report of suspected elder exploitation. I knew every field, every legal term. But when I wrote my grandmother's name in the victim line, it felt like something I couldn't take back. I signed it. Walter co-signed. Sandra had a new active case by noon. Sandra moved quickly. With the third-party report and Dorothy's credit union statement as foundational evidence, she applied for a financial records subpoena. It came back in 9 days. When the main account documents arrived in our department's sealed envelope, Sandra called me into the small conference room. She closed the door behind us. It's worse than either of us expected. She laid the statements across the table. 28 pages, one for each month across more than 2 years. The account had held nearly $140,000 when the records began, a lifetime of modest deposits from a schoolteacher's salary, saved with extraordinary discipline over 4 decades. What followed was a document of methodical extraction. Regular monthly transfers of $1,800 to Gary Voss, described as household maintenance. Invoices from a plumbing contractor that no county business registry could locate. Payments for roof work that a neighbor could confirm had never occurred. Charges billed through a medical services company that Sandra had already traced. It had been dissolved 3 years earlier. The checks written against it had cleared into an account registered to Diane. The power of attorney had been signed during a hospitalization 22 months prior. Grandma had been admitted for pneumonia. Diane had arrived with documents. Just while you recover, Mom, so we can manage things while you're unwell. Grandma signed. She was never given copies. And here was the detail that turned my professional composure into something colder and harder. Grandma's rheumatoid arthritis medication had been billed and unpaid for 3 consecutive months. The pharmacy had suspended her supply. While Gary purchased a new truck and Diane deposited checks from a dissolved medical company, my grandmother sat in her own farmhouse unable to move her hands without pain. Sandra left me alone with the statements. I took them home that evening and read every line of every page at my kitchen table. I've processed hundreds of exploitation files. The patterns were all familiar. But patterns don't prepare you for the final page. Current balance, $4,012. I read it twice. 40 years of lesson plans and chalk dust and patient deposits and careful living. $140,000 reduced to an amount that would not cover 4 months of the medication she'd been denied. I picked up my phone and called Sandra. How fast can we move? Sandra and I met with the assistant district attorney for Camden County the following week. His name was Robert Finley, late 50s, former public defender, the kind of prosecutor who doesn't need things explained to him twice and doesn't pretend to be impressed by what he's seen. Sandra presented the complete evidence package, 28 months of bank statements, the fraudulent power of attorney and its circumstances, Dorothy's affidavit documenting the credit union withdrawals, pharmacy records confirming 3 months of suspended medication, my documented denied visits, and my own recorded phone calls. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. Recording every call from that number had become a professional reflex. Finley reviewed it all for 35 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. You have sufficient grounds for financial exploitation charges under state elder abuse statute. Possibly fraud. Definitely theft above the class threshold. Sandra nodded. What we need to strengthen the case is confirmation from the victim herself. Ruth confirming that she did not authorize these withdrawals, and ideally confirmation that she's been isolated deliberately. Finley looked at me. Can your grandmother make a voluntary statement? Only if we can get access to her. My mother controls the phone, controls the calendar, controls who comes through the door. He tapped the statement stack. We can request a welfare check. Have a county officer do a walk-up interview. She won't speak freely with Diane in the room, I said. She's been conditioned over 2 years. She needs to reach out on her own terms, without an audience. Finley was quiet for a moment. Then we wait for her to do exactly that. I thought about the crossword. About the code we'd established 5 years earlier. That Sunday afternoon I sat with Grandma on her porch and explained what financial exploitation of the elderly actually looks like, because I wanted her informed in case she ever encountered it. She had laughed then. You think someone's going to steal from a retired schoolteacher? I hadn't laughed. And she had listened. I tried calling the farmhouse that evening anyway. Diane answered on the second ring. Hi. I'd just like to say hello to Grandma. She's watching her programs. I can wait. Diane sighed the long theatrical sigh of someone who has made performing exhaustion into an art form. Then her voice dropped into something harder. You want to know what I hear, Caroline? Every week. From the church women, from the cousins, from people who actually show up in this family. They ask me what went wrong with you. All that education. All those opportunities. And for what? I held the phone away from my ear. Mom, can I please speak with Grandma? No. Click. I wrote down the time, the date, a summary of the conversation. Then I tried Marcus. He had blocked me on every social platform after the church potluck incident, so I sent an email. I told him the property taxes were delinquent. I told him Grandma hadn't seen a doctor in months. I told him I couldn't reach her by phone. His reply came that evening. Caroline, I visit every week. She's fine. Mom handles everything. Stop manufacturing drama. I wrote back with the property tax records. One line came back. You don't get to care now. You left. I sat with that for a long time. My brother wasn't a bad person. He had never stolen a dollar from anyone. He went to work 6 days a week, coached youth baseball on Saturdays, brought Grandma flowers on her birthday. In his understanding of the world, he was the loyal child, the one who sacrificed the opportunity to leave in order to stay, to maintain, to show up. He had constructed his entire identity around that. He didn't know about the $140,000. He didn't know about the phantom invoices. He didn't know about the suspended medication or the months of denied access or the power of attorney signed in a hospital room. He only knew the story Diane had authored. Caroline abandoned us. Caroline failed. Caroline doesn't have standing to weigh in on anything in this family. That story was simpler than the truth, and it made his sacrifices feel meaningful. So he had believed it. He wasn't protecting our parents deliberately. He was protecting the only version of reality in which staying had been the right choice. I had seen this before, the unwitting gatekeeper who believes he's guarding the family while the actual victim sits locked inside. My brother was loyal to the wrong story. An email wouldn't fix that. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Dorothy called at 9:30 in the evening. She never called that late. Caroline, Ruth fell in the bathroom. 6 days ago. She bruised her hip and her right hand. Diane didn't take her to a clinic. She said it was nothing serious. I closed my eyes. Bathroom fall. Bruised hip. Injured hand. No medical assessment. I had typed those words into a dozen neglect reports. How bad is the hand? I watched her through the kitchen window yesterday. She was trying to peel an apple and she couldn't manage the grip. A pause. There's something else. 2 nights ago, I was outside after dark. I could see your mother on Ruth's porch. She was sitting alone in the dark, holding a picture frame. I couldn't make it out from my side. She was crying, hard, for several minutes. Then she stood up, wiped her face, and went back inside. I knew which frame. There was one photograph in Grandma's living room that had hung in the same spot since I was small. Diane's high school graduation portrait. 17 years old. White cap, a smile that still believed in itself. Grandma had kept it on that wall for nearly 40 years, her daughter's last undamaged moment, preserved behind glass. Diane looked at that portrait every day, and every day it must have reminded her of the life that had been interrupted before it began. Something shifted in my chest. Not forgiveness. I was nowhere near ready for that. But something like understanding. My mother was someone who had been fractured by a circumstance that chose her at 17, and she had spent the rest of her life breaking the things nearest to her in an attempt to distribute the weight. Dorothy, I said, we're almost out of time. It arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Diane left for the grocery store at 9:15. Dorothy was through the hedge by 9:20. She found Grandma at the kitchen table, a torn newspaper page spread flat in front of her. Crease down the center, the kind of crease that comes from something being folded under a mattress for a long time, waiting. 4 words circled in red ballpoint ink. The pen had been pressed hard enough to leave impressions in the paper beneath. Help. Trapped. Reach. Thanksgiving. Dorothy photographed the page and texted it to me immediately. I was at my desk in Easton when the message arrived. I opened it, expanded it. Read the 4 circled words twice. My hands didn't shake. My heart rate didn't spike. I had trained for this, not this specific moment, but this category of moment. The signal from a person who has finally found the courage to ask. The message that bypasses the gatekeeper. In my career, I had received these signals in different forms: a note folded into a Medicare statement, a word whispered to a visiting nurse while a daughter waited in the hall. Each one was an act of extraordinary courage dressed in ordinary paper. This one was from a 79-year-old woman with a bruised hand and arthritis she was managing without medication, who had pressed that red ink hard enough to leave a dent. I stood up from my desk, walked to Sandra's cubicle, and placed my phone face up in front of her. "We have it," I said. "She's asking for help. She chose the day." Sandra, Robert Finley, and I met in his office that same afternoon. Finley looked at the photograph of the crossword for a long time. Then he looked up. "She chose Thanksgiving." "Yes. The entire family will be present." He looked at Sandra. "You're comfortable with a multi-subject encounter?" "All individuals connected to the financial exploitation will be at the same location. It protects the victim from retaliatory contact afterward." Finley signed the authorization for an emergency APS intervention. Sandra would serve as the lead APS officer. A deputy from Camden County, Officer Dale Hennessy, 15 years on the force, would accompany for legal authority and to serve any necessary orders. I would attend as family. I had no official investigative role. Technically, I was a concerned granddaughter who happened to work in the same field. But everyone in that room understood why I needed to be there. Grandma had sent the signal to me. Not to a hotline. Not to an agency. To Caroline. The granddaughter she had pressed $400 into the hands of 20 years ago, the one she had taught to solve crossword puzzles on a Sunday porch. The one she trusted to decode 4 circled words. I was going home for Thanksgiving. 3 weeks is a long time when someone you love is marking the days. I went to work every morning, managed other cases, attended a training session on Thursday, had lunch with a colleague on Friday. To everyone else in the Easton office, I was exactly who I always was, quiet, careful, the one who arrived first and left last. At night, I returned to the 28 pages of bank statements and read through them again. Not because I had missed anything, because I needed everything to be flawless. If this went to trial, and it would, the record had to be beyond question. One transposed date, one miscalculated total, and a defense attorney would make the most of it. I thought about Diane sitting on the porch with that graduation portrait. I didn't hate her. I didn't even pity her in the way that diminishes someone. I just needed her to stop. Dorothy called every few days with updates. Grandma was eating. Grandma was sitting up in the mornings. Grandma had taken her blue church dress, the one she wore for occasions that mattered, and hung it from the outside of her closet door the week before Thanksgiving. "She wants it ready," Dorothy said. "She knows you're coming." 10 days out, Marcus sent a group text to the extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, with the subject line Foster Thanksgiving at Grandma Ruth's. 24 people confirmed, including Pastor Dennis Yates from the church, the same man who had smiled politely when Diane called me useless at the potluck 2 years earlier. I read that guest list and, for the first time in weeks, I smiled. I didn't need an invitation. I had something better. I spent 2 evenings preparing document packets, 3 copies of the bank statements, the power of attorney with the hospital dates circled, Sandra's formal investigation summary, Dorothy's sworn affidavit, the crossword photograph, printed on paper and placed in a clear sleeve. I organized everything in a manila folder with a case number on the tab. Nothing else. At work I handled my regular caseload. On Tuesday before Thanksgiving I drove to Harlow, checked into the regional motel on the main highway, the same road where Diane made her ATM withdrawals every other Wednesday, and carried my folder up to the second floor room. I laid it on the desk, set my alarm for 5:30, and did what I always do the night before a case comes to resolution. I went to sleep. Thanksgiving morning, 5:30. The room was dark. Outside, Harlow was the kind of quiet that only exists in small towns on holidays, the absolute stillness of everyone either sleeping or already starting something in a warm kitchen somewhere. I showered, dressed, put on the charcoal blazer I'd brought specifically for this. Not a holiday outfit. A work outfit, the same one I wore to courtrooms, victim interviews, every professional moment in my career that had required me to be completely present. Grandma would see it and understand immediately. The blazer meant we were here in a professional capacity. I drove to the diner on Main Street at 8. Eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. I ate slowly and read the paper. I thought about 24 people who would be sitting around Grandma's table in a few hours eating food paid for, in part, with her savings. At 10:20, Sandra pulled into the parking lot in her department vehicle. Officer Hennessy arrived 5 minutes after in his marked cruiser. We took the corner booth. Sandra reviewed the timeline. We arrive at 12:45. Family should be mid-meal. I present the investigation notice. Officer Hennessy provides legal authority and serves the protective order when ready. Caroline, you're there for Ruth. Hennessy looked at me. Thanksgiving dinner. You sure about the timing? I put my coffee cup down. My grandmother chose the day. I'm honoring her choice. At 12:15, we drove out of the diner parking lot in a quiet convoy. Sandra's sedan, Hennessy's cruiser, my 10-year-old Civic. Through Harlow we went, past the elementary school where Grandma taught for 38 years, flag still up on the holiday. Past the church where Pastor Yates was already at the farmhouse, probably saying grace over stuffing bought with pension money. Past the auto parts store where my brother had spent 20 years believing his sister was the failure. The road to the farmhouse winds through 2 miles of countryside, rolling fields, split rail fences, round hay bales wrapped in white plastic. The kind of scenery that makes you believe nothing bad could take root here. 6 vehicles filled the gravel drive. Gary's new truck, Diane's sedan, Marcus's pickup. 3 others, cousins, probably. Smoke rose from the chimney. Laughter traveled through the walls. The smell of roasted turkey and sage hung in the cold November air. I parked just past the mailbox. Sandra behind me, Hennessy behind her. I stepped out, gravel under my shoes. I looked at the porch, the wicker chair, right where it had always been. I straightened my blazer, picked up the manila folder from the passenger seat. Sandra to my left, Hennessy to my right. We walked up the porch steps together. 3 sets of footsteps on old wood. I knocked. Not the tentative knock of a daughter who expected the door to close in her face. A knock that said, "This conversation is going to happen." Footsteps inside. A chair scraped. Someone laughed mid-sentence and stopped. Marcus's voice. "I'll get it. Probably Aunt Patricia running late." The door swung open. Marcus stood there with a dish towel over his shoulder and an easy smile, the relaxed expression of a man playing host on a holiday, confident in his role as the good son. The smile lasted exactly as long as it took his eyes to move from my face to Sandra's APS badge to Officer Hennessy's uniform and utility belt. The dish towel fell from his shoulder to the porch floor. "What?" His voice broke on the single syllable. "What is this?" "Hi, Marcus," I said. "We need to come inside." He didn't move. He stood in the doorway like a man who has opened the wrong door in a dream and is hoping that if he holds still, the scene will reorganize itself into something that makes sense. Hennessy stepped forward. "Sir, this is official business. May we enter?" Marcus stepped back automatically. "You do," when someone in uniform asks calmly. We walked through the front hall, past the row of coats, past the family photographs, past Diane's graduation portrait that Grandma had kept on the wall for nearly 4 decades. The dining room opened in front of us. Long oak table. White tablecloth. The good china, Grandma's wedding set, the one that only came out for real occasions. 24 people seated. Turkey at the center, still steaming. Sweet potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, fresh rolls. The whole tableau of a family holiday. And at the far end of the table, in the chair closest to the kitchen door, sat my grandmother, Ruth Voss. 79 years old. Blue church dress, just as Dorothy had described. Hands folded quietly in her lap. She looked at me the moment I walked through the arch, looked at my blazer. And she smiled, a slow, certain smile that had been waiting a very long time to surface. The room went silent. 24 people froze mid-motion. Forks lifted and held. Glasses halfway to lips. Napkins unfolded in hands. Diane was standing at the head of the table with a serving knife in one hand. She froze. Gary sat to her left. A glass of red wine paused 6 inches from his mouth. Pastor Yates sat across from him, napkin tucked into his collar. Marcus's wife held their toddler on her lap and stared. Diane found her voice. Bethany, Caroline, who are, she stopped. Started again. What is this? Sandra stepped forward. She opened her portfolio, removed the formal investigation notice, and placed it on the white tablecloth next to the cranberry sauce. My name is Sandra Merritt, Adult Protective Services. We are conducting an active investigation into the financial exploitation of Ruth Voss. Over the past 26 months, an estimated $140,000 has been extracted from Mrs. Voss's accounts. Those transactions are traced to Gary Voss and Diane Voss. The words landed in that room the way a stone lands in still water. Aunt Joanne's hand went to her mouth. Uncle Dale leaned back slowly in his chair. Cousins exchanged glances across the table. Marcus hadn't moved from the archway behind us. Diane put the carving knife down on the edge of the table. Carefully. This is a family dinner, she said. Her voice was shaking. You cannot come into my mother's home and— Ma'am, Officer Hennessy said quietly, please take a seat. Sandra spread the bank statements across the table, between the turkey platter and the breadbasket, each page facing outward so anyone seated could read the numbers directly. These are Mrs. Voss's financial records, obtained through a court-issued subpoena. They document 26 months of systematic withdrawals. Sandra walked through it methodically, the monthly transfers to Gary labeled as household expenses, the payments to a medical billing company that had no physical address and had been legally dissolved 3 years prior, the home repair charges. She gestured toward the window, where the drooping gutter was visible from where we stood, for work that was never performed. Gary set his wine glass down. His hand was shaking badly enough that wine sloshed over the rim and spread into the white linen tablecloth, a red stain opening slowly across the cloth Grandma had used for every holiday dinner I could remember. Helen, Ruth, she gave us that money. His voice was too loud, too quick. She understood what we needed. She wanted to help. Mr. Voss, Sandra said, Mrs. Voss's rheumatoid arthritis medication has been unpaid for 3 months. Her pharmacy discontinued the supply. Her property taxes are 5 months delinquent. The power of attorney was signed during a hospitalization for pneumonia and has never been formally reviewed. Gary's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. He looked like a man who has felt the floor vanish under his feet and hasn't finished falling yet. Diane had not sat down. She gripped the back of her chair with both hands, knuckles pale. Then she turned to me, and her eyes were not frightened. They were furious. You did this. Not a question. You called the authorities on your own family. I looked at my mother across that table covered in bank statements and holiday food and 30 years of quietly accumulated damage. I used the same voice I use in courtrooms. Measured. Even. No heat behind it. I didn't call anyone, Mom. I am the investigation. Something shifted in the room. I felt it before I could name it. A collective exhale, a recalibration among 24 people who had spent 10 years knowing exactly what Caroline Voss was. My name is Caroline Voss. I am a senior investigator with the Tennessee Department of Human Services, Adult Protective Services Division. I have worked in this field for 11 years. In that time, the The cases I've led have resulted in the recovery of more than $3.5 million for elderly victims of financial exploitation across this region. 52 cases. 52 families. I paused. Let it settle on every face at that table. My aunt, my uncle, my cousins, Pastor Yates, every person who had nodded along when Diane described me as someone who had amounted to nothing. You told everyone I sat in Easton doing nobody knew what. I looked at Diane. Now everybody knows. Diane erupted. Her chair went over behind her. She screamed, not coherently, not strategically, but from somewhere raw and old and uncontrolled. Words about sacrifice, about ingratitude, about everything she had given and everything that had been done to her. Her voice rattled the china in the cabinet along the wall. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I stood exactly where I was and waited. I have stood in the center of someone's rage many times. You let it burn. You stay quieter as it gets louder. Because power isn't volume. Power is the person who doesn't need volume. Diane ran out of words. She stood breathing hard, fists tight, tears running down her face. The room was absolutely silent. It is her house, Mom, I said. Her money. Her choice. Gary made one final attempt. He looked at Sandra with the exhausted effort of a man trying to change a story that's already been printed. This is a family misunderstanding. Ruth asked us to manage things. She signed the papers willingly. The power of attorney was signed under hospitalization, Sandra replied without inflection. The company through which 6 checks were drafted does not exist. The deposits from those checks went into an account in your wife's name. Gary stared at the wine stains spreading through the white linen. He did not speak again. And then my grandmother stood up. Dorothy, who had been seated beside her at my request, steadied her elbow as she rose. The whole room turned. Every face. Grandma Ruth stood at the end of that table in her blue church dress, one hand resting gently on the tablecloth's edge. She was trembling, not from weakness, but from the controlled effort of holding something back for a very long time. I taught 3rd grade for 38 years, she said. Her voice was thin. It was also completely clear. I saved every dollar I could. I raised my children in this house. I watched them grow up at this table. She paused, looked at Diane, looked at Gary, and they took everything from me except my crossword puzzles. She paused again, and the silence in that room was total. That was their mistake. Pastor Yates was staring at his napkin. He was not smiling. None of them were. Marcus was standing in the archway between the dining room and the kitchen. He had not moved since we arrived. His face had traveled through shock, denial, confusion, and arrived somewhere harder and quieter. He looked at me with the expression of a person replaying a conversation. Every email I'd sent that he deleted, every phone call he'd shut down, every time his sister had tried to say something was wrong and he had chosen the easier explanation. You were trying to tell me. His voice was barely audible. The property tax. The phone calls. I thought you were. He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. I know what you thought, Marcus, I said. He pressed his palm against the door frame. His eyes were red, fixed on the 28 pages fanned across Grandma's holiday tablecloth. Officer Hennessy addressed the room. Gary was asked to accompany him for questioning regarding potential felony financial exploitation. Linda, Diane, was served with a temporary contact restriction and removed from access to any of Ruth's accounts, pending the investigation's completion. Diane passed Grandma's chair on her way to the door. She stopped. Grandma looked up at her daughter. Not with anger, not with contempt, with the kind of sadness that comes from loving someone for 50 years and watching them choose this. I kept your graduation portrait on that wall for 40 years, Diane, because I was so proud of the girl in that picture. Diane's face broke open. She cried, the kind of crying that happens when you're caught, not when you're sorry. I know the difference. I've seen it 52 times. 4 months after Thanksgiving, Gary entered a plea agreement. Felony financial exploitation. Supervised probation of 2 years, full restitution of $62,000 to be paid incrementally, a permanent no-contact order with Grandma Ruth. His attorney raised the issue of financial hardship. The judge noted that Mr. Voss had managed to acquire a new vehicle and an extensive new wardrobe while his mother-in-law went without prescribed medication. The hardship argument was not received warmly. Diane's case went to a full trial in March. The jury deliberated 5 hours. Guilty on 2 counts of exploitation, 1 count of felony theft. Sentencing followed. The restraining order remained. Grandma's power of attorney was formally revoked by the probate court. Her accounts were audited, frozen, and restored to her sole control. The balance would never return to $140,000. Some of what was taken is simply gone. But the hemorrhaging stopped. Her property taxes were paid. I covered them temporarily, and Grandma insisted on repaying me $12 a month because that is exactly who she is. Her medication was reinstated. A home health aide visits 3 times a week. Dorothy comes by every day. Marcus was silent for almost 2 months after Thanksgiving. No calls. No messages. Then one Sunday morning in late January, an email arrived. The subject line was blank. I'm sorry. I should have listened. I should have been better. I wrote back, come have dinner with Grandma next Sunday. She's been asking about you. He came. He brought wildflowers from the grocery store and a crossword puzzle book from the dollar section. Grandma made him sit in the wicker chair on the porch and refused to let him leave the table until he'd completed the first puzzle in the book. He got stuck on 6 across. She helped him. One Sunday in late April, I drove to Harlow with the windows down. The dogwood trees along Route 7 were in full bloom, white and pink against a sky that had finally decided to be warm. The mountains past the tree line were soft green the way they only get in spring. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the farmhouse. The gutters were new. Marcus had replaced them himself, 3 weekends in a row, according to Dorothy, never once mentioning it to anyone. The garden had come back to life. New tomato plants. A row of basil along the south fence. The herb bed weeded and turned. The porch steps swept clean. In the wicker chair sat my grandmother, Ruth Voss. 79 years old. Blue cardigan. A cup of coffee cooling on the armrest. The Sunday paper open across her lap. I sat down in the chair beside her. She handed me a pencil without looking up. We worked in silence for a while. Just the soft scratch of graphite on newsprint. A cardinal calling from the cedar at the corner of the yard. She tapped one of the clues with her finger. 9 letters. What is built quietly, in the absence of an audience? I looked at her. Character, I said. She nodded. Filled it in with her careful, deliberate hand. I knew you'd know that one. She looked out over the garden. The people who spend their time deciding what you are have no idea what you're building while they're busy talking. She turned the page. But the ones who need you will always find a way to reach you. 4 words circled in red. That was all it took. If someone you love is being silenced by the very people who are supposed to protect them, know this: silence has an expiration date. The quiet ones are often carrying the heaviest fights behind the most ordinary faces. And sometimes, the only signal they can send is a circled word on a torn page. Pay attention. Because they are counting on someone to know the code.